This is an important message from the Ministry of Health and Wellness for non-residents traveling to Jamaica. As of July 1, 2020, the government of Jamaica has modified its entry protocols for all arriving passengers. All non-residents are required to register their entry at visitjamaica.com. Visitors from high-risk locations are required to take the COVID-19 test prior to arrival. High-risk locations are subject to ongoing reassessment, and therefore the list will be updated as necessary. To see the current list, visit the Ministry of Health and Wellness website, moh.gov.jm. Non-residents, including business travelers, visiting Jamaica from these locations will be required to obtain a COVID-19 PCR test within 10 days prior to their intended date of travel to Jamaica. All persons applying to enter on visitjamaica.com from the designated high-risk locations will be required to upload their COVID-19 PCR test certificate as part of the application process. All passengers will be required to show proof of travel authorization upon check-in and prior to boarding flights. Health screening. Upon arrival, all passengers will be subject to health screening and risk assessment by the Jamaican health authorities. The government of Jamaica has modified its risk-based protocols that will determine testing and quarantine requirements for all arriving passengers. Testing protocols change periodically, and as such, at the airport, you may be required for testing. General notice for non-residents. Non-residents visiting Jamaica for tourism purposes will be subject to health screening and risk assessment upon arrival. Tourists demonstrating COVID-19 symptoms will be isolated and tested. All tourists without symptoms will be allowed to go to their hotel or intended address under a stay-in zone order from their date of entry to Jamaica. Those tested will have to remain in their rooms until the result is returned. Tourists must report any COVID-19 symptoms to the hotel medical station. Persons who become symptomatic during quarantine will be subject to testing. Tourists with a positive COVID-19 test will be isolated immediately. Tourists with a negative COVID-19 test will be allowed to remain at their accommodation or hotel property according to stay-in zone orders. Non-residents visiting Jamaica for business purposes. All non-residents visiting Jamaica for business purposes for less than 14 days will be required to be tested at the airport. Business purposes do not include funerals and weddings or other personal activities. Business travelers should await their test results under quarantine at hotel or intended address. Business travelers with a positive COVID-19 test will be isolated immediately. Business travelers with a negative COVID-19 test will be allowed to carry out business adhering to all protocols. General notice. Stay in zone. This measure applies only for tourists who are staying in the COVID-19 resilient corridor designated for tourism purposes. Stay in zone means that persons are required to remain within their accommodation or hotel property for the entire duration of their stay. Stay at intended address for business travelers. Under this measure, short-stay business travelers are required to remain at their intended address, whether a hotel or private home, and allowed to leave only to conduct their business or corporate engagement. Business travelers are required to wear a mask at all times in public spaces, comply with the physical distancing rules, and are not allowed to meet with persons 65 years and over. Business travelers are not permitted to take public transportation or attend any meeting, event, or gathering with more than 20 persons. Please be reminded that 1. Quarantine is intended to restrict movement and may be at home, hotel, or a government facility as determined by the health authorities. Persons under quarantine cannot leave their quarantine location except with permission from the health authorities. 2. Isolation is intended to separate persons who have tested positive for COVID-19 or are suspected to be positive from other persons. This may be at home or a government facility as determined by the health authorities. 3. Monitoring during quarantine or isolation. Persons who are quarantined or placed in isolation at their home, hotel, or intended address will be monitored electronically by the health authorities to ensure that they do not leave their designated quarantine or isolation location. Please take the necessary steps in keeping with the new COVID-19 travel protocols. COVID-19 is not over. Please protect yourself while protecting others.